Hello everyone, I'm Justin and this is everything you need to know before watching the second half of Better Call Saul Season 6, releasing every Monday from July 11th to August 15th. Real quick, if you're watching this video and you haven't yet subscribed, make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to know anytime we upload a new video. A lot has happened already in the first half of Better Call Saul's series finale, so if you haven't yet checked it out, I strongly suggest you do so. But if you have seen the previous 5.5 seasons, as well as the show's sequel series Breaking Bad that ran from 2008 to 2013, and the film sequel to that series El Camino released in 2019, and are just looking for a quick refresher, then you come to the right place. Now, as hopefully all of you already know, Better Call Saul is a prequel to the Breaking Bad TV series, meaning everything that's taken place in Better Call Saul so far, outside of a few flash forwards, happened before Breaking Bad. So to make things simpler, I'm going to run through the important events of both shows in chronological order. So it'll start with the events of Better Call Saul's seasons 1 to 5 and halfway through season 6, before going into the events of Breaking Bad, followed by the flash forwards seen in Better Call Saul. When we first meet Jimmy McGill in Better Call Saul, he's a broke public defender with a clunky old car, working out of the closet of a nail salon. But it looks like he might finally get his big break when he meets with Craig Kettleman, the county treasurer being accused of embezzling $1.5 million, and his wife Betty. Unfortunately, they decide against signing with him, and instead sign with a real firm, Hamlin McGill, run by Howard Hamlin and originally founded by Howard's father George and Jimmy's brother Chuck, who's currently on an extended sabbatical due to a rare condition where he's basically allergic to electricity. So Jimmy looks after him and brings him anything he needs from the outside world. Jimmy used to work in the mailroom at HHM while he took an online course to become a lawyer in hopes of joining the firm. But that proposal was seemingly shut down by Howard, and Jimmy's been attempting to build his own practice ever since. Following his failed meeting with the Kettlemans, a couple of skateboarders attempt to scam him out of some money by making it appear he hit them with his car. But Jimmy knows a scam when he sees one and doesn't fall for it. We learn that growing up in Cicero, Jimmy was known as Slippin' Jimmy and was an expert at conning people out of their money. He eventually ran into some legal trouble though, and after Chuck managed to get him out of it, he made Jimmy promise to give up his life as a con man. But the skateboarders' attempted con gives him the idea of having the skateboarders run their scam on Mrs. Kettleman so he can swoop in and be the hero. But when they run their scam, the driver just hits and runs. So they follow after her and realize they hit the wrong car, with it actually being the car of an old Mexican lady, who turns out to be the grandmother of Tuco Salamanca, a high-ranking member of the cartel. And after the skateboarders call his abuelita a biznatch, he knocks them out and brings them and Jimmy out to the middle of the desert. Jimmy tries explaining that this is all a big misunderstanding, but it looks like Tuco is going to kill him anyway. Luckily, Tuco's partner Ignacio Varga, aka Nacho, allows Jimmy to be let go, believing his story about the Kettlemans. But the skateboarders are only let go after Jimmy successfully manages to talk Tuco down from killing them to just breaking their legs. Not too long after this, Nacho meets with Jimmy at his office, looking for more information on the money the Kettlemans stole, so he can steal it for himself. But Jimmy offers him no help, claiming he's a lawyer, not a criminal. So Nacho says he'll do it himself, and this prompts Jimmy to anonymously call the Kettlemans that night to warn them that they're in danger. But the next morning, the Kettlemans turn up missing and were presumably kidnapped, with the cops' prime suspect being Nacho, who'd been seen outside their home by their neighbor. Nacho claims he hadn't gotten the chance to do anything yet though, and threatens Jimmy's life if he doesn't fix this. And after visiting the Kettlemans' home, Jimmy begins to believe the Kettlemans hadn't actually been kidnapped, but instead went into hiding following his phone call and made it look like a kidnapping. The cops don't buy it, but Jimmy does find one person that agrees with him, that being Mike Ehrmantraut, the parking attendant at the courthouse, who used to be a cop himself and claims he'd seen something like this before. So Jimmy goes looking for them, and sure enough, he finds them hiding out not too far from their home, as well as the $1.5 million they'd embezzled. He tries convincing them to come back and turn themselves in, but although they agree to come back, they don't agree to turning themselves in, and instead offer him a chunk of money to keep quiet about it. He eventually agrees, and their return helps him get Nacho released, so he's able to go back to focusing on his career, now with a bunch of money to work with, and begins specializing in elder law, as well as his services later being called upon by Mike. We learn that almost a year ago, Mike's son Matt, who also worked as a cop, was killed, but the cops never found out who did it. And now the cops are investigating the murder of two of Matt's partners, Hoffman and Fensky, and bring in Mike for questioning. So Mike calls in Jimmy and asks him to help steal the notepad from one of the cops, and Jimmy reluctantly agrees and pours coffee on the cop's suit to allow Mike to grab his notes, from which he learns that they have no actual evidence proving that Mike was the one that killed the two officers. Turns out, during his time on the force, Mike was a corrupt cop, unbeknownst to his son who idolized him. But when Matt later joined the force and started facing pressure from Hoffman and Fensky to accept bribes, he refused, so Mike had to reveal his corrupt past to force him to accept. But feeling they couldn't trust Matt, they killed him anyway, so Mike eventually tracked them down and got his comeuppance. Also seeking Jimmy's services now are the Kettlemans, who decided to fire their attorney at HHM, Kim Wexler, who Jimmy used to work with in the mailroom and had an intimate relationship with. They seem to be in a complicated spot at the moment, but are still very close. So instead of taking on the Kettlemans as his clients, Jimmy asks Mike to help him steal the money from the Kettlemans so Kim can hand it over to the DA as part of a deal to reduce Craig's sentence from 30 years to 16 months. Following this, Jimmy goes back to working with the elderly, during which he realizes one of his clients' assisted living facilities, Sandpiper Crossing, is overcharging them. He eventually manages to form some evidence against them with the help of Chuck, and and it appears to be a big-time case. But Chuck says they won't be able to do it on their own and suggests handing it over to HHM. Jimmy reluctantly agrees, under the impression that he'll at least be able to finally join the firm. But even after offering them this huge case, Howard refuses to hire him. So Jimmy says he'll work on it himself until later that night when he notices a missed call from his cell phone to Howard and realizes that it was actually his own brother that didn't want him working at the firm. And Chuck confesses this to be true, claiming Jimmy isn't a real lawyer.
I know what you were, what you are. People don't change. You're Slippin' Jimmy. And Slippin' Jimmy I can handle just fine, but Slippin' Jimmy with a law degree is like a chimp with a machine gun.
So Jimmy agrees to hand the case over to HHM, but says Chuck's now on his own. Distraught, he then returns back home to Cicero, where he reunites with his best friend Marco, and the two spend the night running scams just as they did in the past. But when they head back out the next night, Marco has a heart attack during one of their scams and passes away. Now, with his best friend gone, Jimmy returns back to Albuquerque, where Kim's managed to get him a job at the firm partnered with HHM on the Sandpiper case, Davis and Maine. But just as he gets to the meeting, he decides the law isn't for him anymore and declines their offer. Kim eventually tracks him down, hoping to change his mind, but Jimmy claims he's done playing by the rules and proves how fun conning can be by having Kim join him in scamming a stockbroker into buying them $50 shots of tequila. Kim actually enjoys herself, and the excitement leads to the two hooking up and rekindling their relationship. But still, Jimmy does eventually decide to go back to being a lawyer and accepts the job at Davis and Maine. Meanwhile, Mike's been trying to provide for his son's wife Stacy and her daughter Kaylee, working a job as a bodyguard for Daniel Wormold, a nerdy pharmacist selling pills to Nacho. But as Daniel starts bringing in some money, he decides to spend it on a bright yellow Hummer, and upon seeing the car, Mike declines to get inside and quits the job, believing the car would draw unwanted attention. So Daniel goes to the deal alone, trusting Nacho enough to believe he doesn't need a bodyguard. But this of course turns out to be a bad idea when Nacho, appearing to just be admiring Daniel's new car, looks in the glove box and finds a document with his address on it. Nacho then goes to Daniel's house and steals all of the pills, as well as his baseball card collection, prompting Daniel to stupidly call the police, who end up finding the hole in the wall where he'd been keeping the pills and bring him in for questioning. So Mike meets with Nacho and threatens to inform his partner Tuco of his side business if he doesn't give the cards back. So he does, and Mike then calls Jimmy to help lower the cops' suspicion of Daniel, which he does by convincing them the hole contains sexual pie-related home videos. Outside of this, Jimmy's been working on client outreach on the Sandpiper case, and forms an idea to create a commercial that would convince clients to sign with them. Cliff Main says he's open to the idea, but Jimmy takes this as an okay and puts out his commercial, created with the help of some college interns, and it proves to be a success. But releasing an ad without the consent of the board infuriates them, and although they decide against firing him, they do remove his ad, which they claimed wasn't on brand, and release a new one of their own, while Kim also gets in trouble with HHM due to her involvement with Jimmy and is put in doc review. In an attempt to regain their trust, Kim reaches out to a bunch of old contacts, and eventually one comes through with her old friend Paige working for Mesa Verde, a big local bank looking to expand. She gets them to sign with the firm, but it doesn't do anything to help her standing, so she begins entertaining offers elsewhere. Jimmy, meanwhile, decides working for a firm like Davis and Maine just isn't for him, so he goes out of his way to get himself fired, allowing him to keep his bonus. He then proposes the idea to Kim of starting their own firm together, but Kim doesn't want to partner with him if he's not going to play by the rules, so she instead offers to work as solo practitioners but in the same office, and he agrees. So Kim hands in her resignation at HHM while still managing to keep Mesa Verde on as her clients. But when Chuck gets word of Kim leaving and working alongside Jimmy, he personally meets with Kevin Wachtel, the CEO of Mesa Verde, and Paige, and convinces them to stay with HHM instead. The meeting takes a lot out of Chuck though, so Jimmy looks after him for the first time in a while. But while Chuck is unconscious, Jimmy finds the Mesa Verde files in his study and heads over to a copy shop where he alters the documents, changing the address of their new branch from 1261 Rosella Drive, Scottsdale, Arizona to 1216. Chuck proposing the wrong address ultimately causes their hearing to be postponed 6 weeks and for HHM to lose Mesa Verde back to Kim. And this slip up seemingly drives Chuck over the deep end, and he starts putting space blankets all over the ceiling and walls of his home, claiming the electricity is wearing down his mind. So Jimmy, worried about his brother's mental state, confesses to altering the documents, but it turns out Chuck had been recording him the whole time and that this was all a ploy to get Jimmy's confession, who he'd suspected was behind it from the start. Jimmy's unaware of the recording though, but eventually finds out about it through his old friend from the mailroom, Ernesto, who had been acting as Chuck's assistant since Jimmy cut ties with him and heard the recording while putting batteries in the tape recorder. So he told Kim what happened, who then told Jimmy, and upon learning this, an angered and manipulated Jimmy rushes over to Chuck's house, kicks open the door, and berates him as he pries open the drawer containing the recording before destroying it. But once again, this turns out to have been part of Chuck's plan, when he reveals Howard and another of his associates are there as witnesses to Jimmy breaking and entering, as well as him destroying potential criminal evidence. Jimmy, represented by Kim and Chuck's lawyer, eventually come to an agreement of only a year's probation if Jimmy admits to everything, but sabotaging legal documents would cause Jimmy to be permanently disbarred, which is really all Chuck wants, so Jimmy and Kim form a plan of their own. Things look pretty bad at first after Chuck's backup tape is played in court, but Jimmy claims that he only said those things to prevent his brother's mental state from going off the deep end and that it was all a lie. Chuck explains he's perfectly fine mentally though, and that his condition is a real thing, but Jimmy looks to prove it's all in his head by pulling out a phone from his pocket that Chuck hadn't reacted to at all. But Chuck sees through this scheme and reveals the phone's battery had been removed. But Jimmy then tells him to check his breast pocket, which is revealed to have a fully charged battery inside that had been slipped into Chuck's pocket earlier by Jimmy's associate Huel Babineau, an expert at pickpocketing. And this revelation prompts an angered and embarrassed Chuck to express all of his built-up animosity towards Jimmy, which effectively loses him the case, and Jimmy is only disbarred for a year. Meanwhile, Kim's been very busy recently trying to handle Mesa Verde all on her own, as well as a new client they recommended, and pulling all-nighters trying to get her work done nearly turns out to be fatal. When on her way to a meeting, she falls asleep at the wheel and crashes her car. Nearly losing Kim causes Jimmy to rethink some of the decisions he's made, specifically destroying the career of his brother Chuck. So he goes to meet with him for the first time since the trial and is shocked to see all of the lights on and electronics running when entering the home. After having it proven that his condition was all in his head, Chuck began his road to recovery, gaining the help of a doctor and eventually even being able to go to the grocery store on his own. But his meltdown at the stand caused HHM's associates to lose trust in him, and in turn the firm as a whole. So Howard suggested Chuck should retire, but he refused. So Howard, no longer trusting Chuck himself, instead just bought him out of his own pocket and had the whole company give him a big farewell. Still, Chuck continued pushing forward and is seemingly fine by the time he's met by Jimmy, who apologizes for everything and tries to make amends, but Chuck claims there's no need to reconcile.
I don't want to hurt your feelings, but the truth is, you've never mattered all that much to me.
Although Chuck looked fine during his meeting with Jimmy earlier, we see that he's actually worse than he's ever been. And after not being able to sleep that night, he begins tearing through the walls of his house to turn off any sort of electricity that could possibly be on. But the pain won't go away no matter what he does. So Chuck, no longer trusting his own mind, kicks over one of his gas lanterns, igniting a huge fire that kills him. Throughout all this going on with Jimmy, Mike had gotten himself involved with Nacho, taking on a job for 50 grand to kill his partner Tuco, whose addiction to crystal meth had caused him to become even more erratic than usual. But instead of killing Tuco, Mike took the smarter route and got him locked up by dinking his car and taking a beating from him just as the cops arrived. Tuco's also caught carrying an unlicensed firearm, so he's likely going to be locked up for a long time. But not too long after this, Mike's met by Tuco's uncle Hector Salamanca, another high-ranking member of the cartel, who attempts to persuade Mike into telling the cops the firearm was his, so Tuco's sentence can be shortened. Mike refuses at first, but after Hector's nephews Lionel and Marco Salamanca show up threatening his daughter's life, Mike agrees. He doesn't plan on stopping there though, and sets out to kill Hector, but before he can follow through with it, he's stopped by an anonymous letter telling him don't. This leads to Mike finding a tracking device in his car, which he swaps out with one of his own before draining the battery of the original. So when someone comes to switch out the dead tracker for a new one, they end up taking Mike's tracker instead. They eventually find his tracker though, and decide to just finally meet with him, and it's revealed the letter and tracker was sent by Gustavo Fring, the founder of fast food restaurant chain Los Pollos Hermanos, who's also an undercover meth kingpin working alongside the Salamancas in the cartel. But although the two work under the same boss, Don Eladio, they've never seen eye to eye. When Gus first got into the meth business, he and his partner, Max Arciniega, met with Hector, Don Eladio, and Juan Bolsa, and during said meeting, Eladio had Max shot in the head by Hector, since he felt the two had disrespected him by secretly dealing under his nose. Gus did eventually gain the favor of the cartel after becoming such a big earner, but he secretly made a vow to force them all, specifically Hector, to suffer for what they did that day. Gus won't allow Mike to kill him though, since he believes Hector deserves a punishment worse than death. However, he does allow Mike to disrupt Hector's means of distribution, and with the Salamanca's original means of distribution now being shut down, Gus becomes their distributor, to the displeasure of Hector. So he seeks out a new business to distribute through, that being Nacho's father's automobile upholstery shop. Nacho's father doesn't want anything to do with their criminal business though, so Hector threatens his well-being, which doesn't sit well with Nacho. So to get rid of Hector, Nacho switches out the pills Hector uses for his heart condition for sugar pills. And the next time Hector attempts to use them, which happens to be during a meeting with Bolsa and Fring, his heart goes berserk and he goes into cardiac arrest. As he's being rushed to the hospital, Nacho drives through a bridge where he dumps the fake pills into the river. But unbeknownst to him, he'd been being watched by Victor, one of Gus's loyal henchmen. So during their next pickup at the Los Pollos Hermanos chicken farm, Nacho and his current partner Arturo are attacked by Gus and his men, with Gus suffocating Arturo to death with a plastic bag.
I know what you've done. From now on, you are mine.
Gus's men are able to cover up Arturo's death as being caused by a rival gang, so he's now able to shift his attention to the creation of his secret underground meth lab for when he eventually cuts ties from the cartel. He brings Mike in to run the operation, as well as some German engineers to actually build it. But to keep the job as low profile as possible, the engineers must stay isolated during the building process, away from their loved ones. As the year progresses, this eventually proves to be too much for the head engineer, Werner Ziegler, who misses his wife so much that he decides to run off. As Gus's crew heads out to search for him, they're they're unknowingly watched by the new leader of the Salamanca side of the business, Lalo Salamanca, another of Hector's nephews. Speaking of Hector, although his original diagnosis was pretty bad, he's now been nursed back to health, regaining consciousness, and although he's lost the ability to speak and is confined to a wheelchair, he's still able to understand conversation and communicates using a bell given to him by Lalo. Surprisingly, it was Gus who helped him recover, but only because he wants him aware of the tortures he plans to put him and his family through. Lalo's also aware of Gus's vendetta against his family, so he's been keeping a close eye on things on Hector's behalf. And after seeing Gus's crew all on the move, he begins tailing Mike, who heads to Travel Wire, a money transfer office where he learns Werner had been, as well as the spa resort Werner went to after. He eventually notices Lalo tailing him though, and gets away by entering a parking lot and clogging the machine with chewing gum. So Lalo heads back to Travel Wire, where he kills the employee Fred, before looking through the security footage to see what Mike was doing there, and also figures out the spa resort Werner went to. He then calls him, pretending to be another of Gus's employees, but Mike makes it to Werner just as he answers the phone, preventing Lalo from learning anything about their operation. Gus still is furious that Werner had escaped and nearly allowed the Salamancas to discover what he's doing, so he orders Mike to kill him. And although he doesn't want to, since he and Werner had become pretty good friends during the course of the project, he reluctantly follows through with the order. Shifting back to Jimmy, although he was initially saddened by the death of his brother, he very quickly got over it and actually doesn't seem to care about it at all. He began looking for a new line of work shortly after and eventually ended up with a job at CC Mobile, from which he also began a side hustle of selling some of their phones to criminals for profit, under the fake name Saul Goodman. He continued doing this until his lawyer's suspension was finally over, and all that was left was to go through a committee meeting to get reinstated. But the committee shockingly denies him for being what they considered as insincere, and Kim deduces this is due to him not having mentioned his dead brother at all. So at his appeal, Jimmy plans on reading a letter Chuck left him in his will to show how much he and his brother loved each other. But just as he begins reading it, Jimmy breaks down and seemingly speaks from the heart, claiming he'll never be as good as Chuck, but he'll always try to be worthy of the name McGill. And this works in getting him reinstated. But it turns out Jimmy had been acting the whole time, and he still doesn't seem to care about his brother's death at all. Nor does he care to work under the name McGill anymore, so he applies for a DBA.
Wait, Jimmy, what?
It's all good, man.
Jimmy believes that for his new law practice, the criminals he'd been selling phones to could be great potential clients. But since they don't know him as Jimmy McGill, he'll now be doing business as Saul Goodman moving forward. And it proves to be a success, with him racking in more clients than ever. Although Jimmy's law practice is thriving, Kim has begun feeling dissatisfied with her current situation with Mesa Verde. After her accident, Kim realized that she couldn't handle all of Mesa Verde's needs on her own, so she joined another big firm, Schweikart and Coakley. This in turn allowed her to spend more time doing public defender work, which she found to be much more enjoyable. But she again begins having issues with her work on Mesa Verde, when in order to build a new call center, they have to force an old man, Everett Acker, off his land. Kim doesn't like the idea of kicking an old man out of his own house for some big bank though, so she instead comes up with a plan using Jimmy's conning expertise, and Jimmy becomes Acker's lawyer, helping him delay all of Mesa Verde's attempts to build their call center. Mesa Verde won't back down though, so they put together an even bigger scheme involving Jimmy creating a bunch of anti-Mesa Verde commercials. But after her boss, Richard Schweikart, starts suspecting she's been working alongside Jimmy in favor of Acker and not her own clients, Kim decides to pull the plug. So Jimmy meets with Richard, Kim, Kevin, and Paige to make a deal, but instead of making said deal, he goes through with their original plan and successfully cons them into moving their call center elsewhere. Kim's furious that he turned him and her versus the bank into him versus her, but he claims he only hit it to protect her legally. It still looks like this may be their breaking point though, until she shockingly suggests they get married, but only to prevent any more secrets since they'll have spousal privilege, and Jimmy agrees. So the two head to the courthouse the next morning to make it official, but Kim makes it clear that there can't be any more secrets, no matter how badly Jimmy doesn't want to tell her. But directly after this, Jimmy's legal services are called upon by Lalo Salamanca. Lalo had called upon Jimmy earlier to get one of his guys a deal with the DEA, but now Lalo himself has been locked up, although under a fake name, Jorge de Guzman, so the police don't know they have a member of the cartel in custody. After Lalo nearly discovered Gus's construction project, Gus decided to put the project on hold as long as Lalo's on this side of the border. He then had Mike anonymously give the police information on who killed the Travel Wire employee, and they eventually tracked down Lalo. So before they can discover his real identity, Lalo wants Jimmy to get him out on bail so he can head back to Mexico, and Jimmy's later met by Mike, who informs him that the people he's working for also want Lalo to head to Mexico. So Jimmy manages to get him bail, although it's unfortunately set at $7 million, but Lalo says he can make that work, and offers Jimmy the job of retrieving the money, which Jimmy agrees to in exchange for $100,000. He then meets with the cousins who give him the money before driving off, but on his way back, he's ambushed by what appears to be a rival gang, and after retrieving the bags of money from his trunk, they go to kill him, but luckily the gunman is taken out by a sniper in the distance. The other men are then killed as well, and it's revealed that the sniper was Mike Ehrmantraut, who had been keeping an eye on the money drop, but didn't expect the shootout to go down. He and Jimmy start heading back, but eventually Jimmy's car breaks down, so they have to push it over a cliff and move forward on foot, eventually making it back to Albuquerque after an excruciatingly long walk. Upon his return, Jimmy hands over the $7 million and gets Lalo bailed out, with a cover story that his car just broke down so he had to walk all the way back. Meanwhile, Gus finds out that it was actually Bolsa that set up the hit on Jimmy, believing Lalo's imprisonment would end their feud. Although Jimmy promised to no longer keep anything from Kim, he believes it's best for her not to know what went down during the pickup, and sticks with the same story he told Lalo. But she learns that something else went down after finding his coffee cup with a bullet hole in it. And nearly losing Jimmy makes her realize what's truly important to her, and she leaves Mesa Verde and Schreikert and Coakley to focus all of her time on pro bono work. Meanwhile, Lalo begins his trip back to Mexico, but stops after seeing Jimmy's car pushed over a cliff with bullet holes in it. So he heads back and confronts Jimmy at his home, repeatedly asking him to retell the story of what happened over and over again, until Kim interrupts and fearlessly questions him. He admits to having seen Jimmy's car, and Kim comes up with a cover, claiming that in New Mexico, if you leave a car on the side of the road, someone's gonna shoot it up. She then continues to berate him and claims that he needs to get his house in order instead of relying on a lawyer he barely knows to do his bidding. So Lalo leaves and makes his way back to Mexico, while Jimmy and Kim hide out at a hotel for the night. With everything that's happened, Kim still decides to go to the courthouse the next morning for her clients, and while there, she's met by Howard. After Chuck's death, Howard fell into a deep depression, feeling he was the cause of Chuck's suicide by pushing him out of the firm. But he eventually got back on his feet, and HHM began thriving once again. In his attempt to make up for the wrongs of his past, he offered Jimmy a job at HHM, but this rubbed Jimmy the wrong way, so he just started messing with Howard by throwing bowling balls at his car and sending prostitutes during his business lunch. So now, Howard confronts Kim about this, and suggests that Jimmy should seek out help, but Kim just laughs in his face and becomes angered when he assumes Jimmy made her drop Mesa Verde. While Kim was working, Jimmy went over to Mike's house looking for more information on Lalo, and after displaying his fear of losing Kim, Mike tells him that Lalo will be dead by the end of the night. With Nacho now having become Lalo's most trusted associate at the behest of Gus, who threatened to kill his father if he was unable to gain his trust, Lalo decided to bring him along on his trip to Mexico, looking to get him a promotion in the cartel hierarchy. But as we know, Nacho is still working for Gus, and so when the planned hit comes to fruition, Nacho's the one who causes the distraction and opens the gate to allow Gus's hitmen in. But Lalo proves to be a more formidable opponent than they had thought, and manages to take them all out. He then has the final remaining gunman radio in that the job was finished before killing him as well, and heading off to enact his revenge. Meanwhile, Jimmy and Kim meet back up at the hotel and jokingly discuss ways they can mess with Howard, but it eventually becomes more serious, with Kim suggesting to potentially destroy Howard's career so they can finally get Jimmy's share of the Sandpiper case. Although HHM refused to hire him when he handed over the Sandpiper case to them, they did agree to give him 20% of the final settlement.
You would not be okay with it. Not in the cold light of day. Wouldn't I?
Real quick, before we move on to Season 6, I just want to make sure that if you haven't seen any of the first 7 episodes of the current season, that you go check them out first before coming back for our recap of them. After opening Lalo's gate, Nacho trusted that he and his father would finally be set free to start new lives. But it turns out, Gus was never planning on letting him go, believing he would always be another loose end to worry about. Nacho eventually realizes this, but agrees to do whatever Gus wants as long as his father is kept safe, and Mike promises to make sure Gus keeps his word. So they retrieve Nacho and bring him back to the US, where he's brought before Bolsa, Hector, and the cousins, and confesses that he had been working for Alvarez, the head of a cartel in Peru, but claims he would have done the job for free because he hates every last one of the Salamancas. He then shifts his attention to Hector, and confesses to having been the one who put him in a nursery home, after switching his heart meds for sugar pills. Upon learning this, Bolsa decides he's heard enough, but before he can do anything, Nacho breaks out of his zip tie with a broken shard of glass he'd secretly grabbed earlier, and holds Bolsa at gunpoint. He then takes a look at Hector, then looks at Gus, and lastly looks out at Mike, watching from a distance, before shooting himself in the head. Meanwhile, after faking his own death, Lalo called his uncle Hector to inform him that he's still alive and planning on returning to hurt Gus's business before killing him. But Hector suggests a different idea, to instead find proof of the lab so they can cut out Gus without getting cut out of the cartel themselves. So Lalo heads to Germany, where he finds Margaret Ziegler, who then leads him to one of Werner Ziegler's men from the construction of the lab, Casper, who he tortures into telling him where the lab was being built. He then made his way back to the US, hiding out in the sewers as he waited for the right moment to enter the laundry, which the lab was underneath. But when he calls Hector once again to fill him in on what he's learned, he realizes that someone's tracking the call, with that someone being Gus, who'd realized Lalo was still alive after a meeting with Hector and Bolsa, who was hoping the two would finally call a truce. But based on Hector's confident smile, Gus knew there was something else going on. Lalo of course knows it's Gus tracking the call, so instead of telling Hector his real plan, he tells him that he's going back to his original plan of just killing Gus, which sends most of the laundry's security to Gus's home. But before Lalo goes to enter the laundry, he notices a roach crawling on a pipe, and instead heads in the opposite direction. Meanwhile, Jimmy and Kim have begun setting up their scheme against Howard, at first subtly damaging his his reputation by convincing Cliff Main and some of his other associates that he has a drug addiction, as well as Jimmy impersonating him to make it appear he mistreats prostitutes, until Howard found out of their scheme and sent a private investigator to follow Jimmy's every move. Kim also feels that she's being followed, but it doesn't appear to be Howard's PI, and after she confronts them, she's met by Mike Ehrmantraut, who informs her that Lalo's still alive, so he's having his men watch over her and Jimmy in case he shows up, and asks her to just pretend they aren't there. She agrees and also decides to not tell Jimmy about this so he doesn't have to worry. But going back to Howard's PI, it turns out he's actually been secretly working for Kim and Jimmy, so the photos he was bringing in to Howard were set up by them, and eventually their big plan comes to fruition during a mediation between Sandpiper's lawyers, HHM, and Davis and Maine, with the PI having brought in photos that convinced Howard that the mediator for their meeting, Judge Casimiro, was being paid off by Jimmy to make sure the case was settled. Also on the photos was a sticky substance that dilated Howard's pupils, so with Howard throwing out wild accusations with no evidence, since the photos were later swapped out by Howard's PI without him knowing, and him appearing to be on drugs, Cliff is forced to settle. Howard confronts Jimmy and Kim later about their elaborate scheme, and expresses his disappointment in the life Kim's decided to take on, believing she had greater potential than this. They ask him to leave multiple times, but he refuses and continues berating them until suddenly, Lalo Salamanca enters the room. He claims he's just there to talk, but as he pulls out a silencer for his pistol, Howard realizes he may be in danger, but before he can leave, Lalo shoots him in the head. Since that's where Better Call Saul left off for now, we're gonna jump forward a bit to the events of Breaking Bad, in which we never actually meet certain Better Call Saul characters, the main ones being Lalo and Kim. In Breaking Bad, we first meet Saul Goodman when he's met by Walter White, a former high school chemistry teacher who, after being diagnosed with cancer, began cooking and selling meth alongside his partner and former high school student, Jesse Pinkman. Walt and Jesse originally had a working relationship with Tuco Salamanca, who by this point had gotten out of prison and began running the family meth business. But they soon realized they had to get out of this relationship after witnessing Tuco beat his business partner to death in front of them for talking out of line. They made plans to kill him, but before they got the chance, Tuco kidnapped them, with plans of taking them to Mexico while he laid low so they can continue cooking for him. While held captive, Walt and Jesse unsuccessfully attempt to poison him and are nearly killed, but they manage to catch Tuco off guard, with Jesse landing a gunshot to his stomach that allows them to escape. And Tuco is then killed when DEA agent Hank Schrader shows up and shoots him in the head. Hank hadn't shown up expecting to have a shootout with Tuco though, and was actually looking for his brother-in-law Walter, whose family had grown concerned with him being missing for a few days. After learning from Walt's wife Skylar that Walt had apparently been buying weed from Jesse Pinkman, which Walt had told her to lower her suspicion of his criminal activity, Hank went looking for Jesse and eventually tracked down his car, surprisingly in the possession of Tuco, who was bleeding out against it. Still, Hank managed to kill him, and Walt and Jesse were able to excuse their disappearance. Now without a distributor to help move their product, Jesse forms a team with his friends Skinny Pete, Badger, and Combo to take care of the distribution, but one of them quickly ends up getting caught by the cops, so they meet with Saul Goodman to get him out.
Seriously, when the going gets tough, you don't want a criminal lawyer, right? You want a criminal lawyer.
Their first encounter with Saul doesn't go how they'd hoped, with Saul planning on having Badger take a deal with the DEA and tell them what he knows about Heisenberg, Walt's alias in the meth underworld, so they kidnap Saul and threaten to kill him. At first, Saul thinks they're members of the cartel sent by Lalo.
No, it wasn't me, it was Ignacio, he's the one!
But he quickly realizes he's not in any actual danger and eventually agrees to partner with them, while also getting Badger a shortened sentence without making a deal with the DEA. Not too long after this, another one of Jesse's dealers gets in trouble, this time with Combo being killed by a rival gang. So Saul offers them a safer way to move their product, claiming to know an honest-to-God businessman.
Let's just say I know a guy who knows a guy who knows another guy.
It turns out the guys he was talking about were Mike Ehrmantraut and Gustavo Fring, who agrees to work with them after they successfully complete a timed deal. Meanwhile, Tuco's cousins Lionel and Marco come to the US to find and kill Tuco's killer, who they at first believe is Walter, but Gus is able to turn their attention to Walt's brother-in-law Hank instead, since he was actually the man who killed him. They end up failing in their attempt to kill Hank though, after Gus anonymously warns him of their arrival, and Hank kills Marco with a shot to the head while critically injuring Lionel, who is then later killed by Mike while in the hospital. After finding out the cousins attacked the DEA agent without his consent, Juan Bolsa calls and accuses Gus of being behind the hit, but Gus had already planned against this and has Mexican authorities kill Bolsa. Jesse meanwhile had begun seeing a girl named Andrea, who we learn has a little brother named Tomas and a son named Brock. As she explains to Jesse the life her brother has taken on, we realize that her little brother is the same boy who we saw kill Combo, and Jesse later learns that the gang Tomas works for actually works for Gus. So he confronts Walter about this, and Walt sets up a meeting between him, Gus, and the two dealers. They eventually come to an agreement to no longer involve kids in their operation, but instead of letting Tomas go, the two men decide to kill him. So Jesse tracks them down, and it looks like they're about to have a shootout, until the two men are suddenly run over and killed by Walt. Walt's then confronted by Gus the next morning, but Walt knows he won't kill him yet, since no one else can cook meth as pure as his. So they agree to let him go back to cooking. At the beginning of their working agreement though, Gus had only hired Walt and not Jesse, and instead Walt worked alongside Gail Bedecker, who we saw Gus had big plans for in Better Call Call Saul. After a while, Walt was able to convince Gus to hire Jesse as his partner. But now, after killing 2 of his men, Gus makes him work with Gale once again. Gale studies Walt's technique over their next few cooks, and eventually feels that he can cook meth as pure as his. So Gus sends Mike and Victor to bring Walt back to the lab to be killed. In an attempt to get out of it, Walt says he'll give up Jesse's location, who had been in hiding since the incident. But when they allow him to call Jesse, instead of giving him up, Walt tells him that he has to be the one to kill Gale. Walt had realized early on that Gus planned on replacing him with Gale, so he worked with Jesse and Saul to figure out where Gale lived so he could kill him first. But as he was on his way to do so, he was picked up by Mike and Victor, so now Jesse has to be the one to do it. And after making it to Gale's apartment, Jesse reluctantly does kill him, and is only caught after the fact by Victor. Gus then kills Victor in front of Walt, Jesse, and Mike, since he was seen by civilians when he arrived at Gale's apartment, before telling them to get back to work. Walt's still worried Gus wants them dead though, so he makes some more of the ricin poison they originally tried to kill Tuco with, and has Jesse hide it in a cigarette. Jesse's life, meanwhile, begins spiraling out of control following his first murder, with his drug addiction now being worse than ever. So to straighten him out, Gus has Mike take him on a few ride-alongs, and Gus seemingly takes a liking to Jesse, with him being consistently brought along to meetings, one of which almost turning into an all-out cartel civil war. So Gus brings them to meet with Don Eladio, looking to smooth things over, and even brings a bottle of tequila as a gift. But it turns out the tequila was poisoned, and Eladio and his crew were killed, with Jesse killing its final member. Upon returning to the US, Gus meets with Hector Salamanca, and during said meeting, it's revealed that the crew member Jesse killed was the last remaining Salamanca other than Hector, Joaquin Salamanca, his grandson.
Now, the Salamanca name dies with you.
Also, while in Mexico, Jesse proved that he could cook meth just as pure as Walt's on his own. And recently, the tension between Walt and Jesse had reached an all-time high, with Walt furious that Jesse hadn't taken this opportunity to poison Gus, prompting the two to even get into a brawl. So Jesse agrees to work for Gus alone, but although Gus would prefer to, he won't allow him to kill Walt, so Gus just fires him. Following Gale's death, Walt's brother-in-law Hank had started becoming suspicious of Gus after finding information that could tie him to Heisenberg, who Hank's been on the hunt for since his rise to prominence. And now, since he no longer needs to respect Walt's wishes, Gus says he's going to handle Hank himself, and threatens to kill Walt's entire family if he interferes. Meanwhile, Jesse has continued to build a relationship with Andrea and her son Brock, but one day Brock suddenly has a serious illness, and after noticing the ricin cigarette is missing, he confronts Walt since he was the only one who knew about it. But Walt's able to convince Jesse that it wasn't him and that it had to have been Gus trying to force Jesse to kill him. So the two work with the man who hates Gus most, Hector Salamanca, and set up a bomb to his wheelchair that goes off when Hector rings his bell, killing them both. They then destroy the lab and any evidence tracing Gus's operation back to them, and renew their friendship following Brock's recovery, who hadn't actually been poisoned with ricin, but instead a plant called Lily of the Valley. Turns out that plant grows in Walt's backyard, and it actually was Walt who poisoned him, working with Saul, who got Huel to pickpocket the cigarette off of Jesse. After learning of Gus's death, Mike goes to kill Walt, but he's talked down by Jesse, and the three eventually begin working together, with Walt now being at the very top of the meth underworld. They also begin working with Lydia of Madrigal Electromotive, who acts as their supplier of methylamine until she notices a tracking device on one of the barrels. So instead, she forms a plan for Walt, Jesse, and Todd Alquist, a member of pest company Vamonos Pest, that have been allowing them to use the houses being bug bombed as mobile meth labs to rob a train of its methylamine. And they successfully complete the train heist with seemingly no witnesses until a young boy shows up on his bike. So Todd shoots the boy with no hesitation, believing it was best for the team. This pushes Jesse over the edge, as well as Mike, so the two say they want out and plan to sell their thirds of the methylamine for $5 million each to a rival gang. But instead, Walt convinces the rival gang to become his distributors and buys Mike out of the business himself. Mike then uses the money to continue paying off Gus's guys in prison, but during a money drop, his lawyer's caught red-handed, and Mike's forced to skip town. Walt wants to just have Gus's men killed, but Mike refuses to give him their names. So before Mike can leave, Walt shoots and kills him, only to realize after that he could have just gotten the names from Lydia. And after getting the names from Lydia, and with the help of Todd's uncle Jack, who has connections in prison, Walt has them each simultaneously killed. Jesse, meanwhile, wants nothing to do with Walt or the meth business, and decides to leave even without his money after Walt refuses to buy him out. So for the next 5 months, with no one to share revenue with, Walt makes more money than ever before finally deciding to call it quits upon learning his cancer is back, after having gone into remission not too long after his first meeting with Saul. But while hanging out with his wife Skylar, Hank, and Hank's wife Marie, Hank goes to the bathroom and finds a Walt Whitman book titled Leaves of Grass, with an inscription inside that leads Hank to flash back to an earlier scene taking place soon after Gale's death, where he and Walt were looking through Gale's lab notes. In his notes, a similar inscription was made, beginning with 2WW, but Walt informed Hank that he was just speaking of one of his favorite writers, Walt Whitman. But with this new inscription beginning with "To my other favorite WW" and ending with "Fondly GB," Hank realizes that Walt is Heisenberg. So a betrayed Hank begins searching through evidence in an attempt to find anything that could incriminate Walter, but he's only able to get some concrete evidence through Jesse. After retiring from the business, Walt finally gave Jesse his $5 million, but Jesse no longer wanted what he considered blood money. Being unable to shake the guilt of the death they had left in their path, Jesse's behavior becomes erratic once again, and so Walt suggests he skips town and starts a new life, and Jesse agrees. So Saul sets him up with Ed Galbraith, a vacuum cleaner repairman who also secretly offers the service of giving criminals new lives and identities. But Saul warns Jesse that the guy won't take him if he's high, but Jesse continues smoking anyways. So Saul has Huel pickpocket his dope, but this eventually leads Jesse to the realization of what actually happened to Brock. So he heads back to Saul's office, holds him at gunpoint, and forces him to tell him everything. He then goes to Walt's house looking to burn it to the ground, but is stopped by Hank, who convinces him to take Walt down together. So he and Hank work together to manipulate Walt into bringing them to where he's hidden his money, and finally Walt is arrested. But Walt originally thought it was only Jesse he was meeting with, so he called Todd's uncle and his gang to come and kill him. But now with his brother-in-law being involved, he calls them off. They still show up though and kill Hank, despite Walt begging them not to, before taking almost all of his money, leaving him with just one barrel of cash, and kidnapping Jesse. Now known worldwide as Heisenberg, he and Saul are forced to leave town, so they get new identities with the help of Ed. But before Saul begins his new life, he and his secretary Francesca clear out his office, with him collecting his money as well as a shoebox from inside the walls, and her shredding documents. He then hands her a business card seemingly of an attorney, and tells her to let them know that Jimmy sent her, before making plans to call November 12th at 3 p.m. Walt meanwhile spends the next year plotting his revenge against Jack and his gang, who are now at the top of the meth business, using Jesse, still held captive, as their cook. And Walt eventually follows through with his plan, killing Jack and his entire gang, but during the attack, he's severely wounded while shielding Jesse from the gunfire, and after letting Jesse escape, he dies from his wound. After escaping, Jesse tracks down Ed the Disappearer and eventually begins a new life of his own in Alaska. Saul, meanwhile, now lives a new life as Gene Takovic, the manager of a Cinnabon in Omaha, Nebraska. Gene lives a much less luxurious lifestyle than Saul, being in constant paranoia that he might be recognized. But he does like to look back on his glory days with old tapes of his Saul Goodman commercials. One day, while at work, he suddenly collapses to the floor and is sent to the hospital, where luckily no one learns of his real identity. And it turns out his collapse was just due to stress, so he heads back home, calling a taxi to pick him up. But inside the car, he notices an Albuquerque Isotopes air freshener, and after the taxi driver stares at him for an uncomfortable amount of time, he asks to be let out and finds his own way home. Worried the driver may have recognized him, Gene calls out of work for the next few days and attempts to stay hidden from anyone that may be looking for him. But after finding no signs of him being followed or searched for, he eventually goes back into work, where during his lunch break he's approached by the taxi driver Jeff, who says he used to live in Albuquerque with his ex and remembers Saul's face being everywhere. Gene tries to play dumb, but Jeff doesn't buy it and eventually gets him to say his catchphrase.
Better call Saul.
He and his friend then exit, and Gene goes straight to the phone, calling Ed the Disappearer once again to receive a new identity. But mid-phone call, he suddenly changes his mind and says he's gonna fix it himself. And that was everything you need to know before watching part 2 of Better Call Saul Season 6. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you'd like to see more content focusing on the Breaking Bad universe, let us know in the comments down below. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.